Welcome to an hour of HealthMade Radio. HealthMade is a community for natural health seekers where we educate people about common health conditions and share extensive research on the most effective natural health treatments and promote legislation that protects our health freedoms. A core concept belief is in the innate intelligence and healing power of the body, and if properly supported spiritually, emotionally, and nutritionally, it can find its way back to health. HealthMade Radio will bring information from integrative health experts throughout the world. Check us out at healthmade.co. Health is what you make it. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt, and I will be your host. Today's guest is Dr. James Gordon. Dr. James Gordon, he's a Harvard-educated psychiatrist, is internationally recognized for using self-awareness, self-care, and group support to heal population-wide psychological trauma. He's founder and executive director of the nonprofit Center for Mind-Body Medicine in Washington, D.C., a clinical professor at Georgetown Medical School, former researcher at the National Institute of Mental Health, and was chairman under President Clinton and George W. Bush of the White House Commission on Complementary and Alternative Medicine Policy. He has authored and edited 10 books, including Unstuck, Your Guide to the 7-Stage Journey Out of Depression. He has written for a range of publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Atlantic, and The Guardian, as well as several professional journals. He has served as an expert for 60 Minutes, Today, Good Morning America, CBS Sunday Morning, Nightline, CNN, MSNBC, NPR, and many others. Dr. Gordon's latest book, The Transformation, Discovering Wholeness and Healing After Trauma, represents a culmination of Dr. Gordon's 50 years as a practitioner, teacher, and advocate of integrative approaches to overcoming psychological trauma and stress. Dr. Gordon, it's such an honor to have you on the show today.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
I would like to start with, would you mind defining what trauma is so people really know, how that relates to them?
Trauma is a Greek word. It means injury. Injury to the body, to the mind, to the spirit. And I think what's important to understand is that trauma is going to come to all of us sooner or later. If it doesn't come early in life because of economic disadvantages or neglectful or abusive family or discrimination, it will likely come in young adulthood or midlife as we deal with inevitable serious disappointments in our career or in our relationships, or as we're having to cope with illness or death of our parents or our own illness. And if it doesn't come then, it will surely come if we live long enough to grow old and have to deal with physical frailty, the loss of loved ones, and our own impending death. I think the important thing to understand is that trauma is a part of life and that it is part of being human. And if we can have that understanding, it will help us begin to deal with whatever comes into our lives, whatever challenges us, whatever throws us off balance, throws us into, as trauma does, throws us into a state of confusion and chaos, or makes us shut down emotionally or physically, or does all of those things to us. So it's going to come, it's part of life, and the challenge is how do we deal with it? How do we understand it? How do we move through it? And then also, and this is a very important aspect of the transformation of my book, but of our age-old understanding of trauma, is that it can also open the door to becoming who we're meant to be. That is, it's the soil in which wisdom and compassion can grow, if we can understand it appropriately and deal with it well.
So it's almost like you're mentioning, trauma is something that will take place in every individual's life at some point. So to try to avoid trauma wouldn't really make any sense because it's going to be there anyway. So you might as well then just get to know the tools that you need to learn in order to be able to address the trauma and move through it.
Exactly. Those are tools that we should be learning as adults, but we should also be teaching to our children. So one of the purposes of the transformation and of my work is to make these tools available as widely as possible, because these are really tools for living a full life and for dealing with the challenges that will inevitably come.
Many patients of mine, they start talking about something that happened in early childhood and say, well, that was so long ago. I'm sure I'm not impacted by it still. What are your thoughts about that?
I'm sorry. Could you speak a little louder? I'm not sure I heard everything you said.
Absolutely. Many of my patients, when they talk about stressful events that took place when they're young as children, they say then, well, that was so long ago. I'm sure it's not impacting me any longer. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think what happens with children is when children are traumatized, it goes very deeply into them. This is one of the fundamental insights of modern psychiatry, which unfortunately we're not paying as close attention to as we should. That is, that trauma comes early on, and often we repress it. I mean, that's a kind of technical word. We shut it down even without knowing that we're shutting it down, because it's so painful, and as children we can't deal with it. And then in adulthood we have symptoms, and I've seen this, and I imagine you have too. People, you may see it in yourself, you may see it in other people. There are all these kinds of symptoms, all these fears and anxieties and maybe physical complaints, and you wonder, well, where exactly is this coming from? And often enough, if we give ourselves a little bit of a chance to look, we can discover the origins of these symptoms, of these limitations, of these fears that we may have in our early life. And that understanding can grow and help us free ourselves from the restrictions that have been there for a long, long time, whether we remember them or not.
And I think that's an interesting point, because a lot of the traumas are stored in the subconscious, so it's not really something that we are that aware of, because when we're young, we're not able to really place it in a conscious form, so it's just kind of stored subconsciously. So how does an individual then address that kind of a trauma when they're not conscious of it?
Well, I think the first thing, and the method that I teach in the transformation is a method not only of dealing with the consequences of trauma, but becoming aware of the causes as well. And meditation is central to this whole process, both of exploring what happened as well as treating the consequences of what happened. So as we come into that relaxed moment-to-moment awareness, which is really the aim of meditation, we automatically, without trying, we begin to recall, we begin to notice the thoughts that are preoccupying us. And often enough, we begin to remember, I'm sort of putting that in quotation marks, remember things that we've forgotten. They will start coming up, and we'll start becoming aware of them, and we'll start feeling a little bit of perspective on them. We'll be able to experience them, we'll be able to express what happened, and we'll be able to do something about what happened in early childhood. And that's without forcing. Don't have to force people at all. The method in the transformation is a kind of invitation to both to understand yourself better and to take care of yourself. And as you accept that invitation, you begin to become aware of what has happened and begin to feel the feelings that went along with what happened. Often when we're kids, the feelings are so overwhelming. We just don't, so we shut out the feelings, and we also manage to exclude from our conscious mind the events which cause those feelings.
So it's almost like
we have to get through as kids. We want to survive. We want to make it through. And if there's nobody around who can understand what's going on or is willing to understand, if there are no ways for us to express what's going on or to comprehend what's going on, we have to shut it down. And the invitation to adults is, okay, here, take some time. It's time to take care of yourself. there is a possibility of experiencing what's going on, and there is an invitation to express it and learn from it.
So it's kind of with the meditation, it's like a it's a relaxed observation where you allow them things to rise up. You don't try to forcibly try to remember something, but as you sit in that deep breathing meditative state, things just surface on their own.
Well, just in an ordinary way, we all know how poorly it works when you try to force yourself to remember something. It just doesn't happen.
That's why the shower is the best place.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, it keeps escaping us.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we're going to take a quick break. You're listening to Health Made Radio. I'm here with Dr. James Gordon. He is the author of The Transformation, Discovering Wholeness and Healing After Trauma. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Health Made Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Dr. James Gordon. He's a renowned psychiatrist and author of the book, The Transformation, Discovering Wholeness and Healing After Trauma. So an individual that's gone through a traumatic event, how does that impact their physiology? Does it have an impact on your body as well as your psyche?
Yeah, that's very important. I think that we don't understand that, and not only does it affect our body, but our bodies are a wonderful way of helping us resolve the trauma that comes to us.
And so how can we use our bodies and to help to move through trauma? And how does it? I mean, does the trauma store in certain areas, or is it just located throughout the body as tension, stiffness, inflammation? How does that work?
Those are great questions. So let's start off, though, with what happens to our body when we're traumatized. And there are two basic reactions that we have when we're encountering a situation that's threatening. First of all, the way our nervous systems are set up, a psychological threat to us, we respond to as if it were a physical threat. This is really important. This is built into our biology. So if somebody, insults us terribly, or we lose somebody we care about, or we feel rejected, or we feel inadequate, overwhelmed, it affects us physically as well as psychologically. Now, there are two basic responses. The first is the fight or flight response. Now, everybody who's listening to us has experienced fight or flight many times in their lives. All of us experience it. What happens is when there's a threat, be it a physical threat, psychological threat of a loss of a loved one or a position that's very important to us, our heart rate goes up, blood pressure goes up, we get tense, and the big muscles, blood rushes to the big muscles in our body as if we were actually going to fight someone or we had to run away. And digestion shuts down. Meanwhile, what's happening in our brain is a center in the emotional brain called the amygdala, AMYGDALA, goes into hyperdrive. It's a center of fear and anger in the emotional brain, and it's firing away like crazy. And parts of our brain in the frontal part of our cerebral cortex that are responsible for thoughtful decision-making and self-awareness and compassion, they get a bit shut down. And so we're in a state where our bodies are tense, our heart's racing, we're feeling afraid and angry, we're not thinking completely clearly, and it's hard to connect with other people. That's fight or flight. It is potentially a life-saving response.
And so when an individual then gets into that state after a trauma, I mean, obviously we can't be in that state the whole time. So at some point we need to move out of that state. And does that mean that the trauma is resolving?
We're meant to move. Fight or flight's meant to come quickly and leave quickly. The problem for we humans is we stay in this state for a long period of time. We remember something traumatic that happened to us. You can see this, for example, in people who've been in combat. They come back, they're civilians now, but it's as if they have to deal with life-threatening situations. Or in a domestic situation, let's say you're struggling with your partner about issues in your relationship. Every time you think about coming home, you go into a fight or flight response, as if there were a tiger in your house, and it's only your partner. Or we stay in situations which put us into fight or flight. So that's one response. Okay, the second response comes when fight or flight can't do the job. That is when we're in a situation that is both inescapable and overwhelming. So if you think about an animal in the situation, it would be and it's the freeze response is this response. So if you think about a mouse in the jaws of your pet cat, I've seen this. I used to have cats that were very good mousers, and the mouse would be in the jaw of the cat, and the mouse would go limp. That's going into a freeze response. And if the cat didn't chomp down on the mouse and kill the mouse, cat would often get bored. There's no fun to play with a mouse that's just lying there limp in your mouth. So cat would put the mouse down, Mousie would shake herself off and run back to the mouse hole. The mouse was in a freeze response. The situation was overwhelming and inescapable. So she just shut down. But then, when the situation was over, when the cat got bored, she was able to shake herself off, come back into balance, and run away. So freeze response is a last-ditch survival response, and humans have it too. When we're assaulted by someone who's much bigger than we are, or several people, or if we're raped, or if we're in a situation in a war zone, for example, we're growing up in a violent neighborhood where we're so overwhelmed over the time and we can't get away. Or even if we're in a relationship that's abusive, that either we can't escape because we're a little child and we depend on the people who are abusing us, or we're in a relationship as an adult and we feel we can't go anywhere. We feel it's overwhelming and inescapable. Then we go into this freeze response and our body gets kind of tight or numb. We shut down. We distance ourselves emotionally from the situation. We may not feel anything. We're putting out endorphins that reduce our pain, and we detach ourselves from the situation and we can't connect with other people. So the problem for humans is that these two life-saving responses, fight or flight and freeze response, either persist long after they're needed or we stay in situations in which we are perennially in fight or flight or in freeze. So the approach, any approach that's going to help us deal with trauma, needs to help us resolve these two reactions, which are biological, physiological, as well as psychological. So the basic antidote to fight or flight is slow, quiet meditation. And the one that I teach in the beginning of the transformation is a non-denominational, simple to learn, slow, deep breathing with the belly soft and relaxed, breathing in through the nose, out through the mouth, perhaps focusing on the word soft as you breathe in and belly as you breathe out, and on the feeling of the belly relaxing. Now, if we can do this, even for 5 or 10 minutes a couple times a day, heart rate slows down, blood pressure slows down, digestion improves, the big muscles in the body start relaxing, that amygdala, that center of fear and anger, stops firing so wildly, our frontal cortex comes back online, we're able to think more clearly, have more perspective, more awareness, more self-awareness, more compassion for other people. We're able to connect better with other people. So this kind of quiet, concentrative meditation, concentrating on the breath and on the words soft and belly, is the antidote to fight or flight. Now, the antidote to the freeze response are expressive meditations. Shaking and dancing, fast, deep breathing, jumping up and down, shouting, laughing, wildly hitting a heavy punching bag. Breaking up those fixed patterns of self-protection and allowing ourselves more freedom. So the beginning of the approach to healing trauma is finding and using these antidotes to both fight or flight and freeze response. And once we begin to use these two techniques, and there are many, many kinds of quiet meditation, many kinds of expressive meditations, then we can use all the other techniques for moving through and beyond trauma. But if we stay in this state of agitation, or we're fight or flight, or we're shut down in freeze response, it's very, very difficult. All the other approaches to trauma that are used, like, behavioral therapy or talk therapies of various kinds, they're just not going to work very well. So we need to come into balance first, and then the whole program that I teach in the transformation becomes much more easy to use, much more effective.
So you almost become like the mouse, and that kind of has to shake himself off when you do the shaking and dancing, just to kind of get out of that free state. Yeah,
we're bringing ourselves back into balance, and these techniques are ancient. I didn't make these things up. They're thousands of years old. Humans have known how to use these techniques and how important they were, and we've just forgotten. We've forgotten how important it is to deal with the body, that everything that goes on psychologically is registered in our bodies and affects us on a physical level. So we can reverse those changes by beginning to work with the body as well as with the mind.
That's fascinating. We're going to take a quick break. You're listening to Health Made Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Dr. James Gordon. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Health Made Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with the author of The Transformation, Discovering Wholeness, Dr. James Gordon. So you're explaining these different techniques. Have you seen them work? Have you had people that you've observed go through these techniques and then come out at the other end being much better?
Yes, I think it's important for our listeners to know I've been using these techniques for 45 or 50 years, and the comprehensive program that's there in the transformation is one that we've used at the Center for Mind-Body Medicine for almost 30 years. And we've trained 6,000 or maybe 7,000 people in using this approach, and they in turn have used it with many hundreds of thousands of people here in the United States and around the world. And the research, we've done a good deal of research on this approach. So people who have used the approach in the transformation over the course of 10 or 11 weeks, the research we've done is on people learning and using this approach in small groups, that 80% of the people who came into those groups with diagnosable post-traumatic stress disorder, and I'll explain what that is in a moment, no longer have it after 10 or 11 sessions, and those gains continue to hold over time. So we have lots of research. We've published research on people, children and adults that have lived through wars. We've also published research on health professionals and medical students and others who have been dealing with trauma that's less dramatic than a war. And when we're thinking about people who've had the full-blown picture of post-traumatic stress disorder, those are people who are continually in a state of fight or flight. They're anxious, they're agitated, they can't concentrate, they're hypervigilant, looking around to see what's happening. They're ready to fight all the time, really tense. And many of us may have experienced that. That's one cluster of symptoms. The second is these are people who are preoccupied, as many of us have been at different times, with what happened to us, with the trauma that came, the loss, the insults, the physical injury, the life-threatening illness, the impending death, whatever it may be, continually on our minds. We dream about it. We may have flashbacks while we're awake, scenes where we see the traumatic events. Third major cluster of symptoms, so that's the first one is agitation and anxiety, what's called hyperarousal. The second cluster is re-experiencing, remembering, being preoccupied with the trauma. And the third cluster has to do with avoidance, feeling shut, and this has more to do with the freeze response, kind of shut down, not able to connect with other people, not able to really feel our bodies. So that's the full-blown picture. The people who have all those symptoms and are somewhat or significantly disabled, they can't function very well at work or in school or at home. So the research that we've done is on people with this very significant condition, which about 7% of Americans have, called post-traumatic stress disorder. 7% of Americans will have it at one time or another. So we've demonstrated the effectiveness of the approach in the transformation for those people. We've also demonstrated that it's quite helpful for people who are for people who are chronically stressed but who are not disabled, for people who are functioning but are still more anxious than they would like to be, more agitated, more fearful, more preoccupied with what happened a while ago, what was dismaying, what might happen in the future, with people who just don't connect with themselves or others as well as they might. So some of our studies, we published a number of papers on medical students who are actually a pretty stressed out population. So we've demonstrated that this approach works, and each of the techniques, just about every one of the techniques that I teach in the transformation, has also been demonstrated by itself to be effective for dealing with the symptoms of post-traumatic stress. So, for example, it's not just meditation that's useful. Concentrated meditation is extremely useful. It can help to quiet activity in the amygdala, that center of fear and anger, and decrease the size of the amygdala, while it's increasing the size and increasing activity in the parts of the brain responsible for thoughtful decision-making and self-awareness and compassion in the frontal cortex. It increases brain tissue in that area. But it's not meditation research. There are hundreds and hundreds of papers showing the power of meditation to balance out these imbalances that come when we're traumatized. But the same is true of the other techniques. Guided imagery can also quiet activity in the amygdala, using your mind to imagine, for example, that you're in a safe place. Nutrition can help good eating, and I have a whole chapter on the trauma healing diet. Eating in a healthy way to replenish the damage that happens to our intestine and our whole digestive tract when we're under chronic stress or we've been traumatized has been shown to increase, not only improve digestive functioning, but also improve brain functioning, because the very same nerve, called the vagus nerve, that quiets activity in the brain, that balances out the fight or flight response, also is intimately connected to our digestive tract. So when we're quieting the vagus nerve, we're improving our digestion, and we're also improving brain functioning. And when we're eating in a more healthy way, when, for example, we're replenishing the good bacteria in the microbiome in our small intestine, we're stimulating the vagus nerve in a good way, which leads to rebuilding brain tissue that's been damaged by chronic stress or trauma. So every one of the techniques, spending time in nature, decreases activity in a part of the brain called the subgenual cortex. Name is not so important, but it's an area of the brain responsible for repetitive thinking about unhappy or unpleasant things. Rumination is what we call it. So when we spend time in nature, which is another of the approaches that I recommend in the transformation, we're also demonstrably improving our brain functioning and helping ourselves to recover from trauma. So each of the 20 different techniques that I teach by itself contributes to recovery from trauma, to dealing successfully with stress. And the program as a whole has been repeatedly demonstrated to be highly effective for dealing with trauma, stress, depressed mood, and so on.
What I really love about the program that you offer is that it's scalable, meaning that it's powerful enough to have the impact, but at the same time it's simple and replicatable enough that many people can learn how to do it and help people around themselves. And that's what I really love about the program. And in your book, you've outlined it so beautifully to make it understandable for the reader.
Well, thank you. That's the whole idea. The idea is all the techniques are simple. It's not always easy. Not always easy to do things that are helpful to us, but hopefully, as readers do each technique, read each chapter and experiment with the technique, they'll feel the benefits very quickly, and that will encourage them to keep on going and to really put together the whole program for themselves. And the whole idea of writing a book, to me, is so that people will understand. Otherwise, there's not much point in writing. It's about communicating.
Yeah, we don't write for ourselves. We write to be able to convey a message.
Exactly. But and I hope I've learned that lesson over the years.
So, with what can people expect? I mean, what kind of commitment do they need? I mean, a lot of people, they sit and meditate a little bit and then they think that they're all better. What kind of commitment does an individual need to put in order to be able to see results, especially if they've gone through some pretty rough times?
That's a great question, and I think people will decide what kind of commitment they want to make, and that's what I always recommend. That the idea is to begin and see what happens. So, for example, when what I would suggest is in early on when I teach that soft belly breathing, that slow, deep breathing in through the nose and out through the mouth, do it for 10 minutes to begin with, if you can, and see what happens. And then see what works for you. Some people, even though much of the early research was done on people who meditated for long periods of time, then research was done on people who meditated 40 minutes a day. Now we're seeing that some of the studies that have been done is that people who meditate for 20 minutes a day can also create these same major beneficial changes in the structure and functioning of their brain. And if 20 minutes feels too long, do it for 5 minutes a couple times a day. Just start. That's the thing to do. And then what I've seen, sometimes I've worked with people, done workshops, and they've gone home and they've just started with doing the soft belly breathing, and maybe they've done it 5 minutes a couple times a day. They see some benefit. But as you see benefit from one technique, you have the experience of making a difference for yourself. And that gets you interested in another technique. And it may be going for a walk. Many of us, I know, hopefully you're in an area where people are much more likely to be outdoors, but taking advantage of that, spending just a little bit more time, noticing a little bit more of what's around you. I mean, we humans used to pay very close attention to what was happening in the natural world, but many of us, particularly in cities, have lost that connection. Just reestablishing that connection can make a difference. Paying attention to what's happening in our bodies. Just walking slowly for 5 minutes. I teach at Georgetown School, as you mentioned, and I teach mindful walking to the medical students. So in the second half of the first year, when they're totally stressed out by 6 months of medical school, we teach mindful walking. And so for 15 or 20 minutes, students go for a walk silently at about a fifth their normal pace, just walking in the same place they've walked through 1,000 times. And then they come back in the classroom, and many of them are amazed. They'll say, I didn't know that tree was there. I never saw that statue before. And every year there are 2 or 3 students who say, I never knew that building was there. And they walked there 1,000 times. But we're not paying attention. So as we see the benefits from the techniques, then we get interested. And if that one worked, if I'm more aware of where I am and I feel a little more relaxed and I'm enjoying walking and I can appreciate that I'm actually in a body, I'm not just kind of running around like a head on wheels, but I'm a full human here, that encourages people to use the other techniques. What I suggest is that people, if you want to read the book in out of order, find your own order. Find what's interesting to you. So, for example, you might be interested in doing a laughing meditation for 3 minutes. That can actually be quite powerful. Just laughing, as full-throated belly laugh. It sounds kind of weird, and it is kind of weird at first. But what happens is people find themselves relaxing and find themselves having more energy. Oh, that's a long answer to your question. But I think you start with what you're ready for. If it's 5 or 10 minutes a day, fantastic. Start there. The idea is to begin to pay attention and begin to take a little bit better care of yourself and notice what's possible. And the encouragement will come from your experience.
Yeah, it was. I interviewed B.J. Fogg. Is a behavioral scientist, and his program is Tiny Habits, and it's celebrating just every little tiny habit that you have established as a routine. So just like what you're saying, you got to just start a routine and make it small, make it doable, and celebrate it, and then you build on that.
That's beautiful. Yeah, exactly. And then all of the different techniques can be are opportunities to celebrate. You can make any of them part of your routine, and if at some point one of them doesn't make one that you've liked for a period of time doesn't seem to be useful or effective, let it go. Forget about it. Do something else. There are so many ways that we can take care of ourselves and better understand ourselves and move more easily through trauma. So find the ones that work for you. And part of what I do in the book and the transformation is really help people encourage each reader to create an individual program that works for them. What works for me may not work for you, and that's fine. We're all different.
Perfect. We're going to take a quick break. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. You're listening to Health Made Radio. I'm here with Dr. James Gordon. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Health Made Radio. I'm here with the author of The Transformation, Discovering Wholeness and Healing After Trauma, Dr. James Gordon. Dr. Gordon, I'm curious. You have all these people that have dealt with stressful things, dealing with depression, anxiety. Do you feel that medication to medicate that is the appropriate thing to do, or do you feel that they are missing out on their ability to heal?
Well, it's a really good question. For me, there's a maxim that Hippocrates put out 2,500 years ago. Hippocrates, the father of our Western medicine, he said, "First, do no harm." So what that says to me is that, and that's really been the kind of watchword for me ever since I, became a doctor, even when I was a medical student more than 50 years ago, is use those approaches preferentially which only have benefits and don't have a downside. Now, medication can sometimes be helpful. There's no question about that, although not as helpful as many doctors think. There's been a lot of research done in the last 15 years reevaluating the studies, particularly antidepressants, that showed that antidepressants were quite effective. So they can be effective, but they're not nearly as effective as we first thought when antidepressants were introduced. Maybe the new antidepressants, newer antidepressants like Prozac and Paxil, so-called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and the others. So they can be helpful, but they come with a bunch of side effects. So why not use approaches first that are also demonstrated scientifically to be helpful, that do not have negative side effects? So just give you one example. Physical exercise, aerobic exercise, has been shown to raise exactly the same neurotransmitters, the brain chemicals, that antidepressants are aimed at raising: serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, and releasing endorphins as well. So why not? And the studies are showing that exercise can do just as well, if not better, than antidepressants, with no negative side effects and only positive feelings of well-being and satisfaction and good physical conditioning. So why not start with exercise before going to antidepressants? Meditation can also affect those same neurotransmitters. Why not work with meditation? Food, eating a healthy diet, can also affect those neurotransmitters. So what I would say is, first, and what I do say in the transformation, is see how this comprehensive program, which is putting together many different techniques that have many of the same benefits, the same positive changes as you get from drugs, from antidepressants, anti-anxiety drugs. Why not put together a comprehensive non-drug program and give it an opportunity to work? If it doesn't work to your satisfaction, then look at medication. Medication should not be the first-line treatment. It may be helpful. I'm not saying it can't be helpful. It just shouldn't be what we use first. So I think that's the general rule of thumb, and it works very well. And most people, in my experience, now 50 years of working with people, the vast majority of people, including people who've been quite seriously traumatized, do not need medication. They can work, but some do. And for some, so I think but really it's very, very individual. But what I would say to our listeners is use the comprehensive approach that I'm describing and teaching in the transformation, and then you make up your own mind. But I think it's also important that people look at the research literature. Look at the research literature both on drugs, on medication, as well as on meditation and exercise and nutrition. And then you make up your own mind. I think that the problem has been that too often medical doctors too quickly prescribe these drugs instead of looking at this comprehensive approach. Now, fortunately, more and more physicians are starting. I'm doing a lot of work, for example, with veterans and with the VA system, and more physicians in the VA system are becoming open to the approach that I'm teaching in the transformation. And they're finding it very, very helpful, and they're finding it very helpful to their patients, and their patients are very appreciative that they're taking the time to teach them this approach. Now, your doctor, I'm talking to listeners, your doctors may or may not be using this approach. So I think what you ought to be doing is seeing how it works and sharing what you're learning with them. In some ways, you may be teaching them something that they need to know that will be important to them in the future, because many of these approaches are not in medical school. So the doctors are working with what they learned, which is primarily drug treatment. And this approach now that I'm teaching is really coming into, we're beginning to really understand and use it and understand the the powerful research that justifies it in the last 15 or 20 years, and it hasn't all become part of the medical education.
Yeah.
I hope it will. And we're using this program. We're teaching this to students in about 20 U.S. medical schools right now.
That's amazing. And I think it's important also for the listeners that we just reiterate that this is a program that you've successfully used on hundreds of thousands of people in the worst possible places on Earth, where they've gone through war, gone through devastation. I mean, so to realize that whatever an individual, I mean, obviously I'm not going to downplay what an individual is going through in their own personal life, but meaning that there are people that have gone through tremendously horrendous situations that with this program, they have been helped. And it's not just one person, we're talking about a large scale of individuals.
Yes, thank you. That's true. And, each person, so the evidence is there. When you read the book, read the evidence as well as pay attention to the stories, and then see for yourself. This is really, everybody can make this discovery for themselves. And the approach is just as useful here back home in the United States as we deal with the ordinary challenges of our lives as it is in these catastrophic wartime and post-war and post-climate related disaster and post-school shootings settings that we're working in around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Dr. Gordon, it's been such an honor to have you on the show today and for all the insight and all the help that you bring around the globe. I really appreciate the work that you're doing.
Well, thank you very much. And as your listeners read the transformation, I'd love to hear from them. You can get in touch with me. The information is there in the book, and I'd like to hear how you're using it and what your impression is of what I have to teach and how it works for you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. You've been listening to Dr. James Gordon. Again, he is the author of the book, The Transformation, Discovering Wholeness and Healing After Trauma. This is something that I feel is becoming more and more important because, as Dr. Gordon mentioned, we all deal with trauma at some level, and to have these tools available, it would just help us function at such a better level. That is it for today. You're listening to Health Made Radio. Remember, health is what you make it. And check us out at healthmade.co.